Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. On today's episode, I have philosophy professor Olúfẹ Táíwò on to talk about his new book, Elite Capture, How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else. This is a really timely and important text. I know we've talked about a lot on the show, liberal ideology, co-option of revolutionary energies into the maintenance of the status quo, and this text is really a breakdown of that process and how it happens. We were kind of time restricted. I had to go get my kids from school. He's very busy doing interviews and other things as well. So this interview was a little less than an hour, which is a little shorter than we usually do. But as I said, you can go check out the book. It's definitely worth diving deeper into this argument. And our good friends over at Millennials Are Killing Capitalism also did a wonderful interview with Professor Táíwò that I encourage all my listeners to go check out if you haven't already. Especially if you listen to this episode and want a little more, definitely go check out their interview with him. Without further ado, here is my discussion with Professor of Philosophy Olúfẹ Táíwò and his book, Elite Capture. Enjoy.
Hey there, I'm Femi Táíwò. I teach philosophy at Georgetown.
Yeah, and thank you so much for coming on. I'm really excited to talk with you about this book. I know the book's been making the rounds in general, and especially on the left, there's been a lot of talk about it. So I guess first and foremost, maybe even before we get into the book, I'm somebody that comes out of philosophy. I have just an undergraduate degree in philosophy as a philosophy grad school dropout. So I'm just kind of curious, how did you get into philosophy, and who are some of your biggest intellectual influences?
I got into philosophy, I kind of backed into it. I was studying political science and economics. Those were my majors back at Indiana University, which is where I went to undergrad. But I had heard that philosophy, politics, and economics was a thing that people grouped together. And that seemed to make sense to me as far as, wanting to know how the social world works. Seemed like, one way of going at it. So I just kind of took philosophy classes just as part of that kind of way of thinking about organizing what I was learning. And I just kind of liked it and kept taking classes.
Yeah, and then I know in your book you mentioned figures like, Fanon, Paulo Freire, Emile Cabral. Can you talk about some of your intellectual influences, especially with regards to this text?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many influences, but Emile Cabral is maybe the biggest one. My dissertation was just staring at a few of the things that he said while he was fighting the War of Independence against the Portuguese Empire with the people of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, which is a prominent part of the Elite Capture book also, that political struggle. So I thought a lot about Cabral. I've also, really been influenced by Plato, weirdly enough. It's a kind of something of a love-hate relationship, Plato, I can't stand Plato. I think he's a fascist and, he's squirrely. But in a really kind of interesting and thought-provoking way. And he sets up issues in ways that make me rethink some things that I think. And then there's historians, so many historians I've learned a lot from, Eric Williams, Walter Rodney, a ton of people on that side of things.
Wonderful. Yeah, fascinating stuff. I guess to move into the direction of discussing your book proper, this is a good opening question, especially for those who might not have had the chance to get a hold of the text quite yet. But can you just kind of talk about, why you wrote the book and sort of what you hope to accomplish with it or the intervention that you're making within it?
Yeah, so, I've been in various versions of left culture. I'm an academic, I've been in grad school, I've been in organizing spaces, and I've kind of seen different ways that people have reacted to identity politics and sort of wielded identity politics. And on the one hand, I just consider myself on the team, right? I think of myself as doing identity politics, right? Pan-Africanism is a huge influence on how I think and what I think about. It's how I would identify myself if I really had to. But a lot of the ways that people were using identity politics in spaces didn't really jive with what seemed to me to be good about it. And so I'm experiencing that in spaces, and I'm seeing a lot of criticisms that are coming from places that aren't, where I'm coming from, right? Whether we're talking about the political right wing or the kind of conciliatory centrists, or even left people, but left people were criticizing identity politics from a position of, what people often call class reductionism. None of those were really getting at what bothered me about identity politics. And so I wanted to try to say something about the way that identity politics was being wielded that, didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you absolutely succeed in that, and you bring a lot of clarity to this discussion in the meantime. Talking about identity politics, can you kind of discuss the origin of the term as it's used today? And you talk about how it was initially, and it's sort of an attempt at unity, but that concept has sort of changed and perhaps through co-option and other forces devolved since then. So I was hoping you'd kind of talk about the origins of that politics and about the term identity politics and how it's changed in popular culture.
So the origin story is the Combahee River Collective, a group of queer Black feminist socialists. They were people who had been in a variety of movements and organizational spaces before they formed this collective. They were, veterans of politics. Some of them had been active in, racial justice movements, some in movement spaces for gender justice. A number of them had been in the National Black Feminist Organization. And, I think for all of them, there were things that those spaces were getting right, of course. You should oppose Jim Crow, you should oppose patriarchy, you should oppose misogynoir, as people say it nowadays, right? The kind of intersectional issues faced by Black women. And I think, it seems clear from what they said themselves, both when they made their original manifesto and then later when they gave, a number of interviews, including a whole book of interviews with Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. They opposed the things that those movements opposed, but they also opposed a kind of unity based on setting your own issues aside, right? Which I think is worth opposing. We could, one vision of left unity or class unity we could have is, everybody shut up except about, wages and benefits or something, right? Or narrowly termed economic issues. And I don't think that's a model of left unity or class unity that even makes sense of labor history, much less of how we should think of identity politics nowadays. So what they said about identity politics is, look, from our particular vantage point, from the particular ways that the various systems of oppression interlock and, form our social conditions, we reserve the right to make our own agenda, make our own priorities, and start from there. And starting from there, you could get to coalitional politics. You get to working with other people who are affected differently by those systems. And that's, in fact, what they went on to do. But the point is, we're going to start from an understanding of our situation and analysis rooted in our situation. And, I can't find anything to, disagree with there. Right. That seems like an insight, and it's an important one.
Yeah, absolutely. And how is that term, especially with regards to how they meant it initially, sort of changed and evolved over time? I know you touched on it a little bit in the opening question, but like when people hear identity politics now, it's often, used in a way that is diametrically opposed to that initial, operational definition. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
I think the most important thing to say is that it got popular. So when they formed, they were very plugged in activists. They were making an insight, right? They were adding a kind of they're adding a political insight, and they were doing it from a basis of a lot of political experience and knowledge, and there were just a few of them. And so it was based on what they had experienced and what they had learned and what they had thought up. And now you have this term being used by, thousands and thousands of people, including some people who are like them, right? Some people who are coming from movement context and, coming from a place of deep kind of principle and commitment, but also other people, right? And one of the things that I try to get across in the book is that it is a mistake to think that, we have to root around in these ideas to explain why they get used in particular ways, rather than just appealing to the social world that these things get popularized in. And so what's happened is just that a lot of people who don't have their politics, who aren't trying to do the things that they were trying to do, have gotten use of this term. And a lot of institutions that also didn't have their politics, have gotten a hold of this term. And the way that those institutions and people are set in the social order, the versions of identity politics that are going to kind of win out, that are going to get circulated most often, have to do with all the regular stuff of who has resources and power in society.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's talk about the elite capture, because of course the name of your book is Elite Capture: How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else. So I'm wondering, who are the elites? Because I think a lot of times, especially on the reactionary right, the Tucker Carlsons of the world, this term is used in a very specific way, not to denote the ruling class, the capitalist class, those with actual money and power, but a certain sort of liberal elite, or sometimes it can actually just mean somebody with a liberal arts, university education at this point. So I think there's a lot of muddying the water around that term. So with that in mind, who are the elites, and what is elite capture with regards to identity politics in particular?
So the elites aren't some stable group for the most part, right? What eliteness is relative advantage. And that's pretty much all that I mean by it.
Okay.
And you can't say in general who an elite is until you've said like who you're comparing them to, right? So pick a group of people picked however else, the group of people in the world who play basketball, or the group of people in the world who are white, or the group of people in the world who go to this university, right? And then just put them in order of the relevant kind of social hierarchies of power. And then the people near the top are the elites. And, the right wing are using the kind of flexibility of the term elite to actually block people from analyzing power, which I think should be the purpose of, making this kind of distinction in the first place. There's a few kinds of people, maybe there's a few individuals who are elite in so many senses, or just, elite in such an all-encompassing way that we could just call them elites without making this kind of comparison, right? Maybe Bill Gates is an elite in whatever room he walks in on, all the social strata that matters. But for most of us, that's not going to be the case. And, I use myself as a kind of example of this in the book and in general when trying to sort through this sort of thing, right? If you're talking on the scale of Black people in general, right, if that's the discussion we're having, very clearly, I'm an elite, right? Comparing my living conditions, my income, wealth, and social power to most Black people, the Black 1%, very easily. If you're comparing me, as an assistant professor compared to other professors who outrank me, then maybe not, right? And all of those are kinds of relative questions about how we compare people in groups. But what it comes down to at the end is how power is distributed in any kind of group we might be talking about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense as a functional term that gets this analysis off the ground. So then the next question is just what is elite capture, particularly with regards to identity politics?
So all elite capture is taking that concept of relative advantage and then mapping that onto how the social world works. Right. So if you have a group of people and there's an elite, there's a sort of subgroup within that. There's some people who have more stuff, wealth, power than the other people. Then you can ask, well, do things for the whole group revolve around their interests and their needs? Right. It's probably better to put it, to what extent do the dynamics of the whole group depend on their interests and their needs? Right. Elite capture is more like a thermometer than it is an on and off switch. But the more group politics revolve around what's going on for the people at the top of a group, the more elites have captured that group's politics.
Can you give us some concrete examples, contemporary examples even, of elite capture in our society in particular?
Yeah, so the politics of representation are often an example that people talk about a lot under this heading, right? So we're trying to debate whether or not, we're trying to debate racial justice, let's say, or think about racial justice or advance racial justice in practical terms. And that conversation ends up drifting towards, whether or not there are movies about a particular race or starring a particular race of actor, right? That's a clear case where, that is of a clear material interest to a very small but powerful and influential subgroup within the total set of people of color. But it's not clear what the whole group gains from there being, more movies starring Black people or more movies starring Asian people or whatever it might be.
I see. Now, I've kind of long argued that, one of the more potent innovations of liberal ideology in the past decade or so is the specific co-option of social justice language as a weapon against the working class and anti-imperialist left, and I think this dovetails with your analysis quite well. Especially, folks to the left of, even like a Bernie Sanders, for example, a tepid social democrat, got labeled a racist, a sexist, and in one particularly desperate and absurd attempt to slander him, even an anti-Semite. I know Ilhan Omar has faced similar accusations, particularly when she critiques Israel, and folks to the left of these people certainly get fired upon in this way as well. So kind of what are your just thoughts on the elite capture of language in particular, and how important is language in the fight against racial capitalism and imperialism?
Yeah, I think there's definitely, something that you could see as co-option of social justice language elsewhere in something that I wrote with a colleague, Enzo Rossi. There we argued that there's a kind of woke aesthetic that's been captured by the powers that be. Our leading example of that being here in Washington, D.C., where I live, the mayor painting Black Lives Matter on a plaza near the White House on the street where protesters were getting their asses kicked by the cops. So, it's a very kind of uncanny resistance to the way that the actual world is working, that this aesthetic has managed to navigate for certain powers that be. But I do think there is a healthy amount of situations like I just described, right? The mayor painting Black Lives Matter on the street, but increasing the police budget. There's a healthy amount of just kind of cynical, very clear-eyed co-optation of left figures and aesthetics and ways of talking. But I also, one of the things I centrally argue for in the book is that, we should kind of provincialize those examples a little bit, right? Because what's happening on a systemic level doesn't actually require that we think that's what's happening in all or even most cases. I think it's just it's as simple as, if a term gets popular, there's going to be a range of people who get to participate in the actual social practices of using that term, of producing media, using that term, or that analysis, of holding events or issuing grants, using that term or analysis. And it's just the case, based on how we've set up society, that the most advantaged people are going to be extremely overrepresented in what movies get made, what grants get issued, what newsroom conversations are like about all those things. Why? Because, we have set up the world to disproportionately allow privileged people to make the decisions about all of the above. And at the same time, world historically speaking, we're on the other side of an extremely violent, deliberate war to erode the kind of left institutions, working class institutions that could have constrained those people. Mm. So you have a kind of double movement in terms of upward redistribution of resources, wealth, and social power, while the kinds of organizational constraints on that wealth and social power get eroded. And those are the two dials that turn elite capture up or down.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In your book, you also talk about deference politics, the sort of culture built around identity politics and its relationship to elite capture. I was hoping that you could help the audience understand what that term means, deference politics, and then its relationship to elite capture in general.
Yeah, so deference politics is just a way of describing a sort of moral, intellectual, and or practical reflex that people have developed, or at least it seems to me that people have developed. So one thing you could do is you could look at oppression, right? And you could learn the lesson from oppression that a lot of people have argued that we should learn, right? Which is that, marginalized people, disadvantaged people sometimes have advantages in figuring out things about the world. It's the people who are disproportionately incarcerated that know more than anybody else what it's like to be incarcerated, what it's like to be over-policed, what those systems are like from an experiential standpoint. And that seems true, and that seems important. But one thing you could do about it is you could say, well, if I meet a person from a social category associated with oppression, if I meet somebody who is a woman and I'm not a woman, if I meet somebody who's trans and I'm cis, if I meet somebody who's a person of color and I'm white, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to follow their lead in general. That's going to be plan A. And then, any other complications that plan A doesn't solve, then, maybe I have some other moves to make. But what I'm going to start with, my default orientation to politics is going to be doing what somebody else from an oppressed group tells me to do. And I just don't think, there's a lot of things wrong with that, but maybe the most direct thing to say about it is it's actually your job as a person, as a participant in whatever it is that you're going to be doing politically. It's actually your job to figure out what it is that you think, what it is that you're for, and what it is that you're going to stand for at the end of the day. It's not the job of the person of color in the room with you, or the woman in the room with you, or whatever it might be. It's your job.
Yeah. And yeah, so in this regard, something like, an elite representative of a certain oppressed identity group makes it to the upper echelons of the political or economic system, like Vice President, for example, Kamala Harris. And then the fact that she is a member of an oppressed minority group, as there's sort of a move to try to defer to her and her lived experiences, and any critique of her position in the hierarchy of power and wealth is labeled as a racist or sexist attack on her identity in particular. Is that kind of the basic outlines of how this works in practice?
Yeah, that's definitely a way that it can work in practice. And I think one of the things that I tried to call attention to that your example just there is a good example of is, it's not as though we're taking some kind of random sample from the particular oppressed community we might have in mind, right? The people that we encounter and the reason that we encounter them, those things have everything to do with the oppressed system that we're trying to respond to. And so we're likelier to get exposed to particular kinds of people, right? Kinds of people who the social structures, the organizations, the institutions that we live in are likely to promote and expose you to. There's a reason that a lot more people know Harris's name than the name of somebody who's incarcerated, right? And those are aspects of the social system that we should also be trying to change, and not just, whether or not people take Harris seriously enough.
Yeah, and in your book, you towards the end, you bring up this idea of constructive politics, and this is a way out of, or at least a way to combat, if you will, elite capture. So I was hoping that you could talk about what you mean exactly by constructive politics and how this could possibly get us on the road to combating a lot of this, elite capture, if you will.
So a little bit ago, I was saying that there are basically two things that fuel elite capture, right? Inequality itself and the existence of, or lack of existence of, effective organizations or social practices that constrain the effect of inequality. So you can make elite capture worse by giving elites more of the stuff today than they had yesterday, right? If you do that, they're going to be even more able to promote their political perspectives and ways of thinking and ideas than they were yesterday. The other way that you can make elite capture worse is you can destroy the organizations like unions, like tenants unions, like movement journalism that might constrain elites. And so the constructive view is pretty much just the opposite of those things, right? What we could be up to when we're thinking about what to do politically is just trying to close the gap of power between those on the top of the system and everybody else. And what you need to do, the ethos you need to have, the kind of plan A you need to have, I think the kind of plan A you need to have is to build stuff. Some of that stuff might be literal, right? If one of the gaps is education, let's say, in some parts of the world, it might be that you need to build a schoolhouse, a literal physical structure to do the stuff. But some of the building might be organizational or institution. Maybe it might be building a union or a tenants union or a debtors union, a workers union or a debtors union or a tenants union. It might be building a social club around sport or around art to bring people together so that, they might be more tied together socially and more willing to help each other out in other ways, right? It might be building tools, it might be building databases, but it's putting things together and building things, changing what the practical environment will be like tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. Those are the things that we could focus on rather than whose lead to follow in a particular conversation.
Right. Yeah, I've recently been kind of reading into some of the history of Italian communism in particular, and one of the things that they did successfully, at least for a period of time, was to be able to build up an alternative culture with mechanisms of education, of sport, of leisure, of study that was sort of parallel to the more broader mainstream and oftentimes reactionary Italian culture. A lot of people, it seems, on the U.S. left today are sort of stuck in an unproductive place of a lot of the rhetoric and discussions and communications are on these huge platforms owned by some of the richest people on planet Earth, and that can sometimes give people, especially, maybe younger people, a sense that they're contributing, a sense that they're combating the elites. I mean, if you can go on Twitter and underneath a comment left by somebody that's super rich or powerful, you can kind of dog on them, ratio them, etc. And this maybe gives you a fleeting sense of striking back. But I think what you're advocating for is more real world building up of, forms of actual power that can not only just be defensive, but can actually go on the offensive. And the labor movement, for example, is a shining example of this. So I'm just wondering what you think about that. Am I on the right page? And do you kind of agree with me about this sense that social media can give people of being countercultural or combating the status quo while kind of being funneled into the energies that maintain it?
Yeah, I definitely think, it could give us a sense of that we're participating in combat, even though nothing's at stake, right? Or at least nothing is directly at stake. Obviously, things might happen because of what people are saying on social media, but the actual act of ratioing somebody doesn't change the world, right? So that's definitely one thing it could do. Another thing it could do along those same lines is just also help create the bad kinds of conflicts within our spaces. And I think we all probably have experience of this, right? Somebody who we maybe could be friendly with, or at least could productively work with in a political context, we end up, at odds because there's a 3-day quote tweet war over, the proper reading of some obscure Kotsky essay or something. So there's definitely a thing that social media does here, and social media just inflames a thing that has always been true, which is, social movements are social, right? And who likes who gets along with who, that will never stop being a part of politics. But the prominence it has in today's politics may have something to do with these platforms and who controls them and who abuses them. So one of the things that I think, just like the Italian communists that you were talking about, but also like people in U.S. radical political history, Fannie Lou Hamer, and the Freedom Farm Cooperative, right? There's all kinds of creative energy on the constructive side of things, right? Maybe if you grow enough beans, it doesn't matter so much, who ratios who.
Right.
And that's not an electoral response. Though maybe those would work too, right? But it is a constructive response. But building farm cooperatives, building schoolhouses, building political parties, whatever is going to get it done. But those are the questions to ask rather than who said what. Right.
Yeah, and a lot of the confusion I think also on the left surrounds the Democratic Party. And, the idea that we could fight on the electoral front, but that does not need to be synonymous with joining the Democratic Party or seeing the Democratic Party as a mechanism through which we can pursue real change. In fact, I see it as one of the prime barriers to it. But would you see the construction of a political party outside the Republicans and Democrats, which challenge both of them, as a positive development for the left and an example of what you call constructive politics?
Yeah, if we got it done, it would definitely be. It would absolutely be an example of constructive politics. I think the questions there are totally practical. It's just either door number one, under current kind of labor law, election law, etc., is that on what time frame can that happen? And number two, what are the prospects of changing those kind of legal structures to make it happen sooner? But those are practical, tactical, strategic questions. It's definitely a goal worth thinking about and worth trying to achieve if we can. But political institutions like a workers' party, like they have elsewhere in other countries, those are clear examples of the kind of thing that would be constructive politics.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of people, these things will take hard work. They'll take working together. They'll take working with people you don't see eye to eye with on every single issue. And for those reasons and more, it's difficult work, but absolutely necessary work to build these things from the ground up. And they're prerequisites to a lot of the big changes, radical, even revolutionary reforms that we would like to see in our society and in the world order going forward. But it does require that acceptance of this is not easy. But I am wondering, sort of as an aside to this and somewhat related, just kind of your thoughts on the Black Lives Matter movement, right? This huge, historical, amazing movement, I think the biggest in American history, in the face of police slaughtering of black people and incarceration disproportionately of black and brown people, etc. But then there's this other side where not only about the leaders and their money, but also about how the Democratic Party leadership was in a lot of ways able to take some of this energy and funnel it back into the maintenance of the Democratic Party and even into the election of Joe Biden. So I'm just wondering what you think and what you analyze about the Black Lives Matter movement and how it can maybe shed some light on what elite capture looks like in practice.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there are two major things to say. One is that the size of, the movement against racial injustice, against police violence, by some estimates, I saw figures as high as like 1 in 12 people at the 2020 summer protests, after the murder of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Tony McDade, so I think that is a testament to a real kind of generational victory that's been won in the past few decades. And whatever happens with Black Lives Matter Global Network, that victory isn't in the short term going anywhere, though, the assaults on critical race theory and all that is definitely an attempt to roll that back in the long term. But in the short term, those wins are still here. And so I think, it's difficult and disappointing to see the ways that, I think there's been some mistakes by leaders at the top. There's been some successes by leaders in the Democratic Party who had the kind of explicit goal to peel off support in the movement and kind of funnel it into the Democratic Party, as you put it, and not even to change in the Democratic Party, but just this kind of woke aesthetic that we talked about earlier. So those kind of developments are disappointing, but those developments are inevitable. It's a large social system, and the people who want it to stay the way that it is have the lion's share of the resources for doing things. And so it is very difficult to advance towards changing anything and keep, total control ideologically and otherwise of everybody in a large movement. It's just the nature of large movements that, some people will be on a different page ideologically from other people in the movement. And so I don't think the standard for success is, was the Democratic Party able to peel off anybody or even higher ups? But, the question from here is, will there be, is it still possible to construct a version of the movement or a version of the network of organizations that the movement helped promote? Is there a version of that is there a version of working within that where there are real tangible gains on the other side? That's a historical question that we have to answer with organizing. But I am encouraged by, the statement by the BLM 10 or I guess 10 plus at this point, which was an open letter signed by a number of Black Lives Matter chapters and other organizations that was, saying in really sophisticated terms, here's how we would run a movement on this issue in a more democratic way, in a way that had more transparent and accountable decision-making processes. And I think that's the kind of thing that, an analysis of elite capture should lead us to support.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of arguments right now online, specifically around people's response to the leak from the Supreme Court that Roe v. Wade likely to be overturned, abortion rights in general likely to be overturned in this country. And, in response to that, after years of voting for Democrats and even of protesting and holding up signs, you still lose a basic right that the vast majority of Americans support having. And so there's this escalation of tactics where you see people just going, actually peacefully protesting just outside the house of like a Brett Kavanaugh, for example. And then you see elites right, left, and center having their own versions of meltdowns over this idea. And so I wonder what you think of escalating tactics in the face of anti-democratic elite decisions that strip us of rights, and if escalating those tactics and making these people uncomfortable is one of the ways to combat elite capture, or at least start pushing the scales of balance in a different direction. Like there's actually real personal consequences for you as an elite if you are on the wrong side of these issues that we care about. I'm just wondering your thoughts broadly.
Yeah. So I don't know. I've seen a lot of people making kind of moralizing arguments about this, which I just find adorable. And, and weirdly, I never thought I would find myself saying this, but weirdly un-American.
Yeah.
This country exists because people violently rioted when British Parliament tried to increase the price of paper.
Exactly.
And like motherfuckers are out here acting like people holding a sign outside of somebody's house is the total erosion of society. It's cute. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the moral arguments I don't take seriously. I don't think there's an important strategic question that is based on the extent of violence that the right is capable and willing to promote. And I think that is something that we should take more seriously than we do on the left. Because, the amount of guns in this country and the amount of violence it has taken to create and sustain this country, constant warfare. I don't think, if you're fighting the right in this country, you're not up against the kind of bespectacled liberals that I think a lot of radicals, especially academics, are kind of used to, or are kind of imagine sometimes when they imagine, people on the other side of them. And that's not what this is. And so there's a real question on the tactical side about whether or not, about what the response would be and whether or not that's something, we feel prepared for. But that's the only version of the conversation worth having, as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that as well. And community defense organizations, especially when they're tied to other organizations like labor unions or tenant unions or whatever it may be, is, I think, another piece of this puzzle, precisely because the right is so not only willing to be violent, but has the disproportionate amount of the tools needed to carry out violence. And this entire American history is nothing if not a long parade of particularly white reactionary violence in the face of even the most tepid steps forward progressively. So
right.
I think that's that's going to become more important in the years to come. I just like the idea of making elites uncomfortable, specifically when their regime, this capitalist, racial capitalist, imperialist order, is so, as you said, so daily violent. And now we're talking about the stripping of rights away from half of the population, literally violently resulting in, women's deaths, the destruction of their lives, and then just being loud at a protest outside a house is what triggers these people to get angry and freak out. It's like, we have to defend ourselves. We have to defend our communities from the elites and from their decisions. So it's interesting to see how that plays out. I guess this last question as we're wrapping up, because I want to be mindful of your time here, is just like, what do you hope to see from the left in the coming years? What would be a sign in 5-10 years of a left moving more robustly in the direction of a constructive politic in your view?
Orders of magnitude more people. I think, if you have way more tenants unions and way more people in the existing tenants unions, I think if you have higher union density, I think if you have more people in, whatever left organizations, whether it's going to be DSL or DSL, Jesus, DSA or PSL.
I think we'll leave that in. That's a good humor break.
I don't know what's going on there, but all of these organizations that exist to fight, right? To fight for a better world, a fairer world, a more just world, and that exists to do so and make it easier for people to do so. If those have more people and resources, that would be my primary metrics of whether or not the left is doing its job.
Yeah, definitely. We try in our own tiny, humble way to contribute to the bringing of people over to the revolutionary left. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on. The book is Elite Capture: How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else. It's a great book. It's actually on Audible with a great narration as well, which is how I read the book. It's easy to do when you have multiple kids instead of sitting down and reading. So however you get it, definitely go check it out and support Professor Táíwò in his work. Before I let you go, though, can you just let listeners know where they can find you and your book online?
Yeah, you can find the book on the Haymarket or Pluto Press websites. Pluto Press is UK, and you can also find it on bookshop.org. It's another good way to get it, support local bookstores and whatnot. And you can find me on Olúfẹ Táíwò on Twitter or olufemiotaiwo.com.
Perfect. I will link to all of that in the show notes. And thank you so much for coming on. Let's do it again sometime.
Appreciate it. Thanks.